Well, good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Zittrain, and on behalf of the International Legal Studies program here at Harvard Law School and the Harvard Law School Library, we're pleased to welcome you to a semi-delicious lunch, but more important, a panel and discussion with Ambassador Samantha Power. Sam and I have known each other since we were teenagers. Everything essential to frame a proper introduction of her was there then. Her boldness and drive, her combination of informality and gravitas, and her willingness to think and dream beyond what too often appear to be narrowly drawn horizons. Those qualities have given rise to a remarkable, indeed world-changing career. Sam began hers as a journalist, a war correspondent, through sheer force of will. She arrived in Croatia, ready to learn the language and culture, but without a calling card backed by any news organization. 2 weeks later, she offered NPR, quote, something on a ceasefire that had just been brokered, quote, and an hour later, her distinct diction could be heard across America. For NPR, this is Samantha Power reporting from Zagreb. After writing from Bosnia, East Timor, Rwanda, Sudan, and Zimbabwe, Sam returned to the U.S. as the founding executive director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School, a columnist for Time, a national magazine award-winning contributor to The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books. She also wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide, and also Chasing the Flame, a biography of the fearless diplomat and humanitarian Sergio Vieira de Mello. Sam then served on the National Security Council as special assistant to the president, where she focused on atrocity prevention, UN reform, LGBTQ and women's rights, and the prevention of human trafficking. President Obama selected Sam to be the United States' 28th permanent representative to the United Nations, in a process somewhat grippingly documented in the book. Sam has not only contributed but learned. She'll be reading a passage from her memoir, which you're probably familiar with, The Education of an Idealist, and then we'll hear responses from 3 distinguished panelists who've also known and worked with her over the years. People who are as likely to broach questions that might not be among the usual ones, Sam, that you've been encountering on your peripatetic book tour so far. Curious to see. Bill Alford is the Jerome A. and Joan L. Cohen Professor of Law and Vice Dean for the Graduate Program in International Legal Studies here at HLS. Graham Allison is the founding Dean of the Kennedy School and the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government. And Ambassador Wendy R. Sherman is the Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership and Director of the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming out to give your comments. Two logistical notes. Copies of Sam's book are for sale at the back of the room, and she'll be on hand to sign her book after the presentation. We're slated to go till around 1. It's possible we might go a little longer than that, but we have booked the room until 1:30, so there'll be ample time for signing, and after that, it's anybody's guess. The other logistical note is that this is being recorded by at least one source that we know of and is likely to end up on the internet, so be warned. Please join me again in welcoming Ambassador Samantha Power and our commentators. Sure.
Hi, everybody. This is an amazing turnout. I'm really touched. Thank you all for being here. I know Cass made his grades in his class kind of contingent on you being here, so I'll put that to one side. No. But I want to start just by thanking the people who are joining me up here today, or who I am joining. First, Jay-Z, as I call him. He calls me Sam. I call him Jay-Z. What Jonathan left out is, or Professor Zittrain left out, is that we actually did a radio show together in college called Radio Free Yale. It was short-lived, but when I worked with Professor Zittrain and I saw his tenacity, creativity, and brilliance, I decided I might take my try not at journalism but at policy and diplomacy eventually. No, but I actually, working with him at such a young age made me think I had to find a different career, which I managed. Bill Alford, this is a bit of a This Is Your Life. Bill Alford was my teacher when I was a student here at Harvard Law School, and so ahead of his time, was, of course, a specialist and expert in Chinese law, and I learned so much from him. I tell the story in the book about Tank Man and my sort of awakening when I saw the massacre in Tiananmen Square begin back in June of 1989 after my freshman year in college. But when I came here to law school, here was somebody who was introducing me to this entire different side of China, nascent, though it remained at that point nascent, though in some ways it still remains, but Bill has been there every step of the way, and it's such important work, and really I cannot recommend his class or his classes more highly in light of the future that awaits us all. Speaking of the future and China, Graham Allison and I, together, he somehow plucked me from the law school when I was a student and asked me to help him launch a new human rights center at the Kennedy School, the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. So there'd be no Carr Center, but for Graham. And he also, I'm not sure if he's claiming credit for this these days, but he was the one who came up with the title for this book, The Education of an Idealist. I don't know if you meant it as a title, but you said, the book you should write is really about your education as an idealist. So Graham, especially great to have you here. And Wendy, one of the most tenacious negotiators that the US government has ever produced, between North Korea in her years with the Clinton administration, and really the day-to-day negotiator producing the JCPOA, denying Iran a range of different pathways to a nuclear weapon, but basically helping shut down a program that could have produced a nuclear weapon, a program that has, of course, been restarted, unfortunately, in response to actions that the US government have taken. But in addition to being such a role model as a negotiator, she was also just an amazing big sister to somebody like me who was very new to foreign policy and who was trying to manage the work-life balance also of having a couple small kids. At the same time, I was trying to do a national security job, and Wendy wrote the book on how to do that sometimes inelegant dance that so many parents are doing at the highest levels and at the lowest levels all over the country. It's extremely hard, and it really helps to have mentors and big sisters along the way. And then last shout-outs just to two law students who were fact-checkers and researchers on this book, Parker White and Elise Baranowski. They were fantastic, and all inaccuracies that remain are my own, and certainly unintentional, but I hope we caught everything. But thank you, Elise and Parker. So I'm just gonna do a short reading, and then we're gonna get to the responses, which I'm very much look forward to. But the story I tell in the book is very personal, in part because I want it to be read by people who aren't yet at the later stages of their career, but who are just starting out. Because I, like you, was sitting at Harvard Law School, sitting in Professor Alford's class, wondering what I was gonna do with my life, how I was gonna put the amazing gift of this education to use. I had a lot of doubts and vulnerabilities. I was fortunate. I had been a war correspondent. I got to be a part of being at the Carr Center. I got to start to teach. I was an activist. But then I met Senator Obama, and I decided to give public service of a different kind a chance. And I worked with him in the Senate office, a story I tell, which is one of the less inspiring parts of the book, I think, because of what was happening with the Congress at the time, which unfortunately has persisted to this day in terms of division and paralysis. But then I find my way onto his political campaign. And it was a campaign that when I first went to work for him in the Senate, he was adamant that he would not be waging because he was a first-term senator. But I tell the story in the book about how and why he changed his mind. And I was fortunate then to be able to work on the campaign. And I think Professor Sherman was working at the same time on Senator Clinton's campaign. And the campaign got very heated. I tell that story as well in the book. And then was fortunate when Senator Obama won the election. Of course, I got to go to work for him in the government. But this is from the campaign, this little short reading, and it's called Yes, We Can. And I just want to give you a flavor of the book, which is not all policy and law and politics. As I worked at my computer in Winthrop, Massachusetts in the spring of 2007, I was teaching at the Kennedy School at the time, I received an email that was clearly not intended for me. Cass Sunstein, a University of Chicago law professor and an Obama campaign advisor, had written, quote, "Martha, isn't this campaign law group a disaster? As in, worse than, say, anything? End quote. I had met this Cass once before at an academic conference. We had struck up a lively conversation, and I'd learned that, like me, he was an avid squash player, but we had not kept in touch. Cass had seemed almost incurably cheerful during our brief interaction, so the sour tone of his email surprised me. But since it was addressed to Harvard Law School professor Martha Minow, I deleted the message and went about my day. I soon realized, however, that I was not the only accidental recipient of Cass's private lament. Neither Cass nor I were full-time or paid campaign advisors. We were professors who contributed policy ideas by telephone and email to candidate Obama's campaign and who spoke publicly on his behalf. Obama's core staff had assembled a working group comprised of legal scholars to inform his views about an assortment of pressing issues, including how to close the Guantanamo Bay detention facility and how to reverse President Bush's licensing of torture. Obama and Cass had been colleagues at the University of Chicago, where they both taught classes on constitutional law. With a possible Obama speech on the rule of law approaching, the group had produced nothing. In expressing his frustration to Minow via email, Cass had mistakenly autofilled the entire senior staff of the Obama campaign. Where's Cass?
Back there.
There's Cass. He's blushing. His criticism of the law group caused wide offense. Danielle Gray, the immensely capable lawyer in charge of domestic policy, took it as an insult to her leadership and forwarded the email to me saying, "Can you believe this asshole?" A friend of hers converted part of Cass's email into a large poster and hung it on the wall at campaign headquarters. Danielle Gray, worse than, say, anything? Question mark. I felt for Cass. Like most mortals, I had suffered my own email mishaps. Not long before, I had been set up on a blind date by Tom Keenan, a friend and fellow professor whom I'd come to know through his research on mass atrocities. The date had not gone well. I wrote to Tom with a rundown of all I didn't like about his friend, asking how he could have conceivably thought that we might get along. I stressed that the incompatibilities were deep, and I signed off the email, quote, "I think, as the old saying goes, you can only make them dress better," end quote. As soon as I hit send, I heard a ping in my inbox. It was the message I had just sent, freshly delivered as an incoming email. Within seconds of this first ping, I heard a second. I'd received a note from Tom which simply read, "You didn't." I put my head in my hands, then slowly typed, "I did." Tom and I were part of a listserv. Remember those? A listserv of thousands of genocide survivors, scholars, and activists, and I had accidentally sent the note savaging the blind date to the entire list. Years later, when I was serving as U.S. ambassador to the UN, people who had received my email would still exuberantly quote my words back to me. "You can only make them dress better." When the Red Sox began their triumphant 2007 playoff run, Cass was a Red Sox fan too, we started texting each other managerial advice during the games. At first, I didn't attach special significance to the fact that I was taking an inordinate amount of time to craft these texts. I married him. Thank you.
So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at the law school, and especially with Samantha. I'll make 3 points. First, this is a great book, a great read, very well written, quite exciting. And I would say the takeaway is that law students can grow up to do good. An unusual proposition. So it's a fascinating series of stories about the chapters of her life to this point, which have been interesting, as she suggested. I thought I knew Samantha well. I had the good fortune to find her as a third-year law student, knowing that, of course, The law school charges 3 years of tuition, but only takes 2 years of courses. So people have availability, a lot of time and energy. So she worked full-time for me as a third-year law student when we were launching a human rights venture. And in fact, she and I wrote a book together. So I've known her very well as an intellectual colleague. I was aware that she was Irish, so you can occasionally see a little bit of her Irish. But actually, otherwise, I didn't really know much about her. I didn't know about her childhood. I didn't know about her father. I didn't know about her life to that point. It probably says something about me that I have great intellectual colleagues about whom I know virtually nothing, okay, in terms of their lives. But this is an extraordinary life in every chapter, and the book is exciting in that regard. And she tells it as a series of stories rather than a kind of book I would write of analyzing some issue or otherwise. And in the course of it, she takes you through the analysis of problems, real problems that she confronts, but with a personal element. So I would say, again, first big takeaway, law students have a third year, they can do something useful, and then more important than that, they may even grow up to do good. Okay. So secondly, the title of the book. So I did suggest to her at one stage, why didn't she think about the education of an idealist, remembering the famous book, one of the famous books about the 19th century, The Education of Henry Adams. So a liberal who's been mugged by reality is called a neoconservative. That's Irving Kristol's great line. So what is an idealist who's been mugged by reality? And maybe Samantha will say more about that. The book certainly works its way through this. It's certainly not a cynic, okay, though it could be. It's certainly not a conservative, though it could be. In the Henry Adams story, Henry Adams was from the first family of America. His grandfather, John Quincy, was president. His great-grandfather, John Adams, was president. He was, his father was Lincoln's ambassador to Britain during the Civil War, so trying to keep Britain on side rather than with the South. And he was his private secretary, the way John Quincy Adams had been the private secretary to John Adams. So he was supposed to inherit the family mantle. He instead became a Harvard professor, taught history, became very disenchanted with what had happened to America after the Civil War, and then ultimately it's stumbling into World War I. So it's a story of a broken patriot dealing with the realities of life in a crueler world, and a naive patriot who imagined politics wasn't the politics that he ultimately saw, even in the Lincoln administration and certainly thereafter. So, Samantha, what is an idealist, which you were before, who's been mugged by reality? So that's now my second point in it is Syria. So I found the account of Syria painful and unsatisfactory, okay? And so I'm asking you to say more about it. So and a good way to put it would be, is what the US government has done in dealing with Syria good enough? And I would say, as a harder-nosed realist, it's good enough for Americans today. Half of the country has been displaced. 500,000 people have been killed. President Obama announced famously, Assad must go. President Putin said, forget about it. Iran said, forget about it. Assad and Putin now generally welcome people by saying who stayed and who went. And have you heard a single peep about this among Democratic candidates in the current campaign? I haven't heard a single word. So is this good enough? And you deal with this to begin with in the book. You say As you rightly, I had published the first book, A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. In the book, I criticized officials for doing too little to stop major genocides of the 20th century. Now I found myself in the president's cabinet as the Syrian regime was murdering hundreds of thousands of its own people. Samantha goes on, this is why the book is so much fun. She asks, what would the old Samantha say to the current Samantha? How does the author of a book on atrocities defend the US government's inaction in the face of mass murder in Syria? My standard answer rejected the implication that my past and present were in conflict. Quote, the old Samantha and the new Samantha knew each other quite well. They talk all the time, and they agree. The full answer, of course, she says, was more complicated. So as you think about it now, if you were writing the indictment of actions in the case of Rwanda, would you have to temper those? Or if you were writing about the Syrian case, it's sufficiently different, or it's more complicated?
Hi. So usually when I see a book that's over 500 pages long,
Wendy, you weren't supposed to mention that part. It looks, they've done a good job making
but
it look a little slender.
I'm saying it on purpose. My book was only a little over 250 pages, on purpose, because that's all I could read. But I couldn't put Sam's book down. And I couldn't put it down not only because a lot of it was familiar during the Obama years, and we sat in the Situation Room together and lived many of these challenges together, but because Samantha, like myself in my own book, Not for the Faint of Heart, and in Susan Rice's upcoming book, Tough Love, do something different, as Graham just defined, that Graham Allison does not do. We believe that it's not about life-work balance, it's about life-work integration. And so in each of our books, talking about what we did in government or what we did as a law student, I'm a social worker, oddly enough, an organizer and a clinician. But what we each did was say to all of you out here, women and men, it's not that you can have it all of the time, but life is made up of all of this, and that you are your most powerful when you bring it all to the table. Now, will some people cringe when they read about Samantha pumping her boobs while she met with Aung San Suu Kyi? Probably.
Not at the same time. It wasn't
Not at
like
the same
she wasn't
time.
there.
Oh, leave it for the book, Sam. Leave it for the book. Now
All
they'll
right,
go
no,
read the
that's
book.
true. That's true. I should let
Now they'll go read the book.
proceed.
It's far enough into the book. Yes. And there will be debate about whether Sam's told us too much about her life. But quite frankly, I'd rather know too much about her life than not enough, because we all face these challenges every single day. Secondly, Samantha Power has never been faint of heart in anything she's done. And she may not remember this, but I actually met you, Sam, at a Save Darfur event in Washington. I was doing some work with David Pressman, who became your deputy, and trying to help him and Steven Spielberg and Clooney understand a little bit about China, which was very important, obviously, to the Darfur problem. And so, of course, I wanted to get a look at George Clooney. But everyone said to me, have you met Samantha Power? And she was just a young thing, so I thought, really? But it's because at whatever age, and you will read this throughout the book, Sam always spoke up. And one thing that's indelible in my mind in this Situation Room, Sam also talks about a quality that's critical for all of us, particularly all of you high-achieving Harvard Law students, and that is humility. And my favorite story about humility in your book was after you went to work for the president, whom she'd had a very close relationship with, you know, had batted things around in the Senate office, had been a pal, wrote together, really, you know, quite friendly with each other. Now he was president of the United States, and it was as if she disappeared, as if he didn't know who she was. Of course he did, but he had other more pressing things, and Sam is honest enough to talk about that humility that we all have to have when we think we are super important about getting things done. But in the Situation Room, and I'd really like to know how Sam experienced this, in the Situation Room, often we'd have a full discussion, and then the president would say, because Sam was often on a screen from the New York office at the United Nations, trying to get a word in, which is very hard to do when you're on a screen in the Situation Room. And the president would say, okay, Sam, what do you want to say? Because he knew she would push us all to think about the issue on the table in quite a different way. We were in common cause on Syria, to sort of answer Graham's question a bit. And all of us, many of us, were quite shocked when the president didn't take a strike. And in my own case, the last lunch I had with the president, actually right after I left government, everybody thought we would talk about Iran, and all we did was talk about Syria because it was a struggle he never completed. He never completed. A couple of other points before turning it over to Bill. It is hard to create a genocide prevention board, an atrocities prevention board inside of government, which is what Sam tried to do. Quite frankly, as the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, I hated the idea. It was one more mechanism, one more interagency effort to try to confront something that I thought we wouldn't do a very good job of dealing with. But what I admired, and I'd like to hear more about the tension that Sam felt, what I admired was her trying to push us to deal with this difficult issue, which doesn't lend itself to government. It really doesn't. And how she experienced, we tried, but we weren't very good at it. And then the last point I want to make about this really extraordinary public servant is that when it sort of got rumored around that she wasn't going to come to the State Department as Undersecretary for Global Affairs, for Justice, that she was going to be nominated to the United Nations, many of us doubted that she was the right person for the job. We thought she didn't know enough about national security and foreign policy. She didn't know enough about the United Nations. She always pushed the envelope, hard to do in a multilateral setting, hadn't had real legislative experience, even though she'd been in the Senate, and that's what the UN is. It's a legislative body in many ways. But we were all wrong. She built a relationship with Vitaly Churkin, which you'll read about in the book, which is no easy task at all. She got within 48 hours a resolution on the Syria chemical weapons deal, which I was part of the negotiating team to make happen, which was an extraordinary effort. And she got a 15-0 vote on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, also in very short order. So the skills she brought to the table, probably partly from her training as a lawyer, were exceedingly amazing. But I would love to hear more about the tension between your personal and your professional self, how you integrate those two, whether you think the book has too much or too little, and more about how you managed the tension between the government, which often railed against what you were trying to do, even if we admired your trying to do it.
Thank you. Those were great. So thanks to Jonathan Zittrain, to June Casey, Rachel Parker, Sarah Zucker, and Andre Babich for making this all possible. And thanks to Wendy Graham for trekking over from the Kennedy School. So this is really a wonderful book. I had intended to hold off on reading it until last week so it would be fresh. But when I picked up the proofs in early July, I could not put them down. It's amazing. And I say that not only because Samantha was a student of mine some 20 years ago, as you have heard, but because of the way in which the book so eloquently and so honestly and so wonderfully comes to grips with the challenge of trying to harness one's ideas, ideals, and more to make the world better. And by the way, can you imagine what it was like as a teacher to have had Samantha in a class dealing with human rights? Anyway, part of the power, pun intended, of this book emanates from how different it is from most diplomatic memoirs. That's most obvious with regard to grandees such as Henry Stimson, Dean Acheson in President of the Creation, or Henry Stimson in On Active Service, in Peace and War, or Henry Kissinger in all of his books, whose accounts of their time at the highest levels of our diplomatic service have an impersonal Olympian quality that gives their accomplishments, there's really not much more in those books than that, an air of inevitability. Acheson and Stimson, by the way, were HLS graduates, and Kissinger did do a year at HLS while a graduate student in government. But Samantha's book stands out even among more recent, more personal diplomatic memoirs by John Kerry or Madeleine Albright, in whose book, Madam Secretary, we also read of a young immigrant becoming an American. The education of an idealist is remarkable in important part for its forthright rendering of Samantha's and our vulnerability as human beings and what this means for who she sought to be and who she is. This is maybe most evident in her gripping account of her parents, and especially the tragic loss of her father at an early age, but it really courses throughout the entire book. The education of Idealist is neither a self-congratulatory account of good triumphing over evil, nor, Graham, a self-chastising one of realism trumping idealism. Rather, it's a deeply probing exploration of the meshing of what we hope for with who we are, of idealism and ambition, and of individual and institution as forces in history. Now, we see this chiefly with respect to government, where Samantha speaks forcefully about both the challenges and the opportunities that access to high levels of official power mean for one's ideals and ideas. Challenges abound, such as the interplay of aspiration with a variety of constraints. And let me just list some of them. 1, the no less worthy aspirations of other people. 2, the impact of domestic political considerations. 3, the necessity of moving the elaborate machinery of government to actually effectuate what one wants to do policy-wise. 4, the need to engage other nations, being mindful of their own priorities and of the long-term bilateral relationships. 5, the dilemma of making agonizing choices given limits of time and political capital, whether one's own or that of one's higher-ups. 6, the presence of forces and factors beyond anyone's control. And 7th, the very real possibility that even with a success on all of the above fronts, of a public failure, and what that might mean both for the immediate goal being advanced and for the capacity of oneself and one's administration more generally to effect positive change. But just as there are great challenges, so too there are opportunities of which an idealist outside of government could only dream. Let me list a few. Most starkly, there's the possibility of enlisting material force, as in the extraordinary efforts Samantha recounts by U.S. troops and the Center for Disease Control to stem the Ebola outbreak, in the course of that saving untold thousands of lives. Secondly, relatedly, and maybe obscured by the deep cynicism of our age about government, there is a profound and dedicated reservoir of talent in the ranks of government, having the potential to help make one's dream a reality. And one of the many parts of the book I liked in particular is Samantha's repeated and quite specific acknowledgement of people who typically work without individual recognition, to understand that nothing is accomplished without many people involved. Third, additionally, there's the possibility of engaging the occupant of the most powerful office in the world in using its bully pulpit to shine a light on issues about which one cares. And fourth, more personally, there's the platform that being a senior representative of the United States provides to enlist other nations to one's cause and to lend legitimacy to one's vision, both at home and abroad. Scholars would do well to heed the lessons of the education of an idealist, for they hold true not only with regard to ideals, but also with respect to ideas. We academics tend to place far more value on the theoretical, often playing down the importance of effectuating it, dismissively saying that that is the more mundane work of policy. But as Samantha's book demonstrates so well, the process of endeavoring to translate ideas into actualities has the potential to temper ideas, maybe even lending them more rigor along the way, in itself is a complicated process no less worthy of deep study, even if the results in the end may seem a good bit less pristine than the purely conceptual. Now, the principal level on which the education of an idealist plays out is that of an individual, of someone inside government aspiring to live one's ideals. But before closing, I want to note two other levels in which this interplay of aspiration and reality play out in the book. One concerns the U.S. itself as a force in the world. In effect, the tension between our vision of our nation as exceptional as the city on the hill and its actual behavior. Samantha, at various points, as Graham and Wendy noted, especially prior to government service, sought to capture the ways in which we as a nation have fallen short, indeed sometimes far short, of our professed ideals. Witness her writings about the slaughters in Rwanda and Kosovo. Some of which, by the way, led to quite severe attacks on her during the confirmation process. But the book is also redolent with examples of what a force for the U.S., what a force for good the U.S. at its best can be. And the other level in which we see this interplay of aspiration and reality is as a member of a family, of the interplay between one's hopes as a parent, on the one hand, the desire to make a mark in the world and effect the change needed to make it better in general and specifically for one's children. The book discusses the trade-offs of time and mental energy that this involves with a poignancy that again distinguishes it in the most positive way from so much else in the genre of diplomatic memoir, and that I dare say lovingly repays the gifts that her own parents imparted to her. So thank you for the opportunity to speak about this terrific book, and I commend it to all of you out there in the strongest possible terms.
Wow, thank you. It's all downhill once you read the book, unfortunately, after those glowing, no, I'm so grateful, and Bill typed his, so I'm actually he did a distillation of the lessons of the education of an idealist that was as good as certainly any that I've ever come up with, so I'm gonna steal your typed version if I can after.
Absolutely.
But thanks so much to Wendy and to Graham, and let me just touch on a few of the themes that have emerged, and I hope we'll have time also.
Yeah, we can run past the
Yeah, I
anointed
know some
hour.
students will have to go, and that's okay, of course. I guess I'd start just because Graham said something, I had a few digs at law students, but I would just like to take note of the fact that in addition to learning, so I never became a lawyer, I didn't take the bar, so many people here will go on a different path than I have, and I recommend acquiring that that ammunition, I guess, for whatever your career holds in store for you. But the one thing I really want to commend about law students, which to this day, as now a teacher here, blows me away, is the work they are already doing through their clinical programs to help people. And the way they are already using the tools that they are being given, and indeed the tools they came with, to actually be of service, whether it's dealing with housing issues or asylum cases, or anyone. Those are just a small subset of what so many law students are spending their days doing. And so I think that's staggeringly important, and it gives you a taste also, I think, I have a concept in the book, one of the lessons of the idealist, I suppose, is a concept I've taken from two professors, the Heath brothers, from a book called Switch, Making Change When Change is Hard, I think is the subtitle, and this is a book that Cass and I rely on in our course, Making Change, but they have the concept shrink the change, that when you're feeling overwhelmed by the burning planet or by 70 million displaced or by our failure to bring about a diplomatic solution to the war in Syria or by the freedom recession, the human rights recession around the world, where freedom has declined 13 straight years, the biggest declines in established democracies. Like, this can make you just want to watch SportsCenter, or put your headphones on and duck, right? But the concept I latched onto, I first came across this idea in the White House, but was, how do you, you had this huge problem, but what is the slice of it that you can bite off? And how can you shrink, for example, dealing with the refugee crisis in a manner that that will add up if others did the same? And so today that could be, again, working in a clinic or working for the International Refugee Assistance Project, which has a chapter here. It could be just about figuring out where the nearest resettlement agency is, and maybe you can provide some bed linens or helps tutor somebody who's looking for work in English, or give them a lift to a job interview. And some, I think, hear that a little bit as a cop-out, given how transformational some of our solutions need to be. But I think the idea is that, again, if everybody did their share, you could get to that transformational place. Whereas if we seek to bite it off all at once, that can be more challenging. So, but I just commend law students for the good they're already doing, and the way they use this. That's why I came to law school from Bosnia, it was the idea that it was like a tangible tool, unlike a public policy degree. No, just kidding. I believe in that one too, but we're here. I'll be doing my event at the Belfer Center, talking out both sides of my mouth, soon. No, I really am teasing about that, because that gives you the economic grounding and it's just a different vantage, again, on the same set of problems. Second thing, just to respond to directly, and I'll come back to Syria out of this point, but Wendy asked very specifically about something called the Atrocities Prevention Board. And so the idea with the so-called APB, which has been roundly, kind of ridiculed, I guess, on one level, maybe not roundly, but I think is very poorly understood, but has come under significant criticism. But the idea we had was, if we look back at history and we look at issues like Rwanda, or Saddam Hussein's gassing of the Kurds of Iraq, or the Khmer Rouge's genocide, or even Bosnia, were there tools in the toolbox that could have been employed early at minimal cost or at manageable cost that might have made a difference? A diplomatic surge, cutting off an arms flow. In the case of Saddam Hussein, long before the invasion of Iraq, after he gassed the Kurds, the United States government doubled its assistance to the regime, to the Saddam Hussein regime. So the idea with the APB was, let's have a group that can actually get ideas to senior policymakers in a hurry, so that we might not have to get to the really vexing issues that we had to deal with in the Libya case and the Syria case. And so the good that the APB ended up doing was in places that weren't making the headlines. The Central African Republic, the Ivory Coast. And again, you can say, well, if it didn't solve Syria, what good is an atrocity prevention board? But Syria didn't lack for a lack of high-level attention. It lacked for being able to formulate and convince the president ultimately of there being a tool that could be employed that would make a dispositive difference and wouldn't entangle us in something larger. And so the APB's impact, I think, inevitably was going to be felt in other areas. And again, it's not a panacea, but it did mean that also what I learned when I was working on my academic work, again, which I started in a paper for a class I was taking while I was at law school, when I was at 2L. But what I learned was that we look back and we just say to ourselves, how is it possible we didn't do this, this, and this? Like, everyone can agree that that was a good thing to do, like that wouldn't have cost us much, that wouldn't have risked much, that we could have built a coalition to do that. Even China and Russia would have supported that. And so those ideas existed during the prior cases, but they never surfaced to the high level. And so we also created dissent channels, sort of in the news a little bit with the whistleblower, different subject. But the idea that when you have a view that you can get it, you can have the ear of somebody who has the capacity potentially to take action upon it. And I actually think, and I tell this story in a chapter called Toolbox, about a series of issues that just weren't otherwise going to get attention at a high level, including the cause of LGBT rights, which David Pressman and his Wendy's great friend and my great friend and former deputy just drove through the government by virtue of just high-level attention getting asylum cases looked at, getting aid to LGBT rights organizations and legal defender organizations around the world. Again, small things, but that made a difference in some lives. So on Syria, Graham, you described I think what you were describing in the book was, you described my writings in the book on Syria as painful and unsatisfying. It would be shocking in light of our record on Syria, which is painful and unsatisfying, if I could, through a good story, somehow turn the tables on that. And what surprised me a little bit in the way you posed the question is, I don't think that I leave ambiguity about the question of whether I think it was good enough. I do not think our response to Syria was good enough. I mean, whether you're looking at the red line issue, which Wendy alluded to, or you alluded to, Graham, or just the issue of Syrian refugees and when we started bringing them to this country and in what numbers, it was unsatisfying. But I think perhaps the reason maybe I left you a little confused as to where I landed is I tried to do something in the book that we don't do enough in our political debate, which is I tried to give you President Obama's perspective as well. And his perspective is really compelling. I mean, he's like a really good guy. He's really smart. He has really good values. Like, he didn't go into the presidency saying, I'm going to be the guy on whose watch 500,000 Syrians lose their lives, right? There's a set of really compelling sort of competing variables that are pulling him, not least, Graham, you mentioned the democratic debate and how not only has Syria not come up, but foreign policy issues in general aren't coming up. And I think some who criticize Obama say he didn't lead to try to build a kind of post-George W. Bush consensus around U.S. leadership domestically. But I think if you look at the polarization in this country, half the country, we're being led in a different direction to basically disagree with whatever he was for almost no matter what. So the question of whether he could have done more to thicken a kind of internationalist consensus, which, by the way, even within that would have very different views on the use of force, I think is an open, whether any Democrat or any Republican for that matter, given the divisions in our society, can do that anymore, given our media culture and so forth. I think it would have been very hard to do. But in the end, I do come down. I mean, I have a whole chapter on grappling with the question of whether I should have resigned over Syria. I think that leaves you with some sense, at least, even though I ended up staying for a host of reasons I'll come to, but of how grave the disconnect was between, watching what was unfolding, not feeling like what we were doing was making a meaningful difference, believing we had a responsibility to try to do something more, and then fundamentally ending up in the same circular conversation in pretty much every Syria meeting, including, Wendy, after you left. If you played the tape recorder of those meetings, they would sound much the same. Let me quickly get to the lessons of the education, and again, in the hopes of opening things up. I just go through a few that really supplement some of which Bill extracted. For starters, just the importance, this basic lesson of preparation. But not just Wendy mentioned skepticism that I would know enough about foreign policy and national security. I mean, every morning I'd get up and read 200 pages of national security material before I even started my day of negotiation or working with my team. Not reading every word, and obviously I had to distill it, but I mean, preparation, knowing what was going on in the world is the only way you could prioritize and decide where you want to choose your battles, but also the preparation of the kind that I regret not doing more of, actually, which is so often your success in a meeting in government, and this will be true in any institution, including in business or whatever, turns on what you've done before the meeting, the extent to which you've built a coalition, right, Wendy, like on Syria. Had we known going in that the five of us all had the same view, and sometimes you have to learn when you hear people make the argument and then it's too late and the group dynamics take hold. So preparation is key. Second, and this is a little bit a version of the shrink the change point, but I have, Richard Holbrooke was one of my mentors, the late negotiator, who's a very difficult figure, but also a very capable one when he sank his teeth into something. But he was totally unsnobbish about what issues mattered in foreign policy. So on the one hand, he wanted to be in the center of the action where the media was and so forth. But in terms of the people he mentored and gave advice to, if you said you were working on trying to get the United States government to ban landmines, he would act like that was the most important thing going on in the world. He was like our Afghanistan envoy, and yet he would treat that with all the seriousness of trying to figure out whether we surge or draw down our troops in Afghanistan. And the line I quote him saying in the book is, "Go where they ain't." His view was that if you could go to places that actually weren't, necessarily the subject of the president's attention, that where everybody wasn't trying to get into meetings and egos and everything weren't at stake, but where you could find like-minded people within the government, you could get so much done. And that wisdom, as Wendy noted, after my bruised ego recovered from suddenly I was lacking the access that I'd always had initially when I got to the White House, but to recognize that that could be a virtue, that you could be off on your own to do a set of things that people would not necessarily interfere, indeed that the president would be thrilled about, but that other advisors who might have other things going on or other motivations, that they'd let you go off. But the larger process lesson in that is, do you have people in your life who can pull you out of your own self-involvement and say, hey, look where you are, look where you work, you can do, what change are you gonna find if the one that you thought you were gonna make feels blocked at this point? Another lesson really for me was and this is a through line throughout my whole life, but it really distilled for me as I wrote the book, but is on the centrality of human dignity, both in our daily lives, but also if you look at what made a Tunisian fruit vendor set himself on fire, even why did Obama voters in 2012 go to Trump in 2016? So many of them, a sense of dignity violated. Putin, even, you could argue some of the acting out in Ukraine, Crimea, et cetera, and beyond, some sense that America was looking past post-Cold War Russia, and that grievance being something that he tapped. And then I have many more lessons, but I'll just flash quickly to the one that Wendy mentioned about work-life integration, which actually is not a phrase. I do use the phrase work-life balance, but you're absolutely right. Work-life integration is so much better. And the way I encapsulate the essence of my struggle, somehow holding it all together, is in a chapter called not Lean In, but Lean On. And how do you develop the networks and the friendships and the support mechanisms to allow you to be all in on what you're trying to do and also part of the reason I open up my own sense of guilt and that so many parents, men and women, feel, but is just to know that no matter how somebody looks like they have it all together, I have an expression in the book, never compare your insides to someone else's outsides. Chances are their self-flagellation, their sense of falling down on the parenting job or the marriage job or the work job, it's that a lot of that is rumbling around in so many of us, even as we, look very purposeful, going to our Harvard Law School classes and stuff. Just know, insides, outsides, everybody has an imposter syndrome somewhere. And then on the TMI, and I'll close with this, that was shorthand for Wendy's. Did I say too much? Were the nursing scenes really necessary? I think that when you're privileged enough to be professors or to have, been able to serve at the highest levels of government as some of us have, and you just sometimes your story is not relatable fundamentally. It just looks like, for people who want to make a difference, well, how would I ever get there? And so I wanted to start at the beginning and show how my ideals came together, how I struggled, for example, at Harvard Law School, to figure out how this place fit in with prosecuting those ideals, how I was burned in some cases by being too trusting, and then burned in other cases by not being trusting enough, and just introducing people to the complexity of trying to pursue one's ideals in a messy world. So thank you.
Thank you, Sam. So I know some people have to leave for classes, but I think we can stay up here and take questions
Yep.
for at least several minutes more. Oh, so if you have any questions for Ambassador Sherman, start with those.
Ask
And
them all to Sam.
there's a microphone.
And I'm
Hi.
happy to sign books after, too.
Okay.
Hi. So in light of kind of the pessimism about the world, especially in the Western world, I was just wondering what you would advise, like young students, young professionals like us, in terms of the future of multilateral institutions and organizations. One dilemma I think that this generation is facing is whether to go to the supranational level, organizations like UN, et cetera, World Bank, et cetera, or go internal, go to the grassroots, do organizing there. What would you advise young people in today's times about which way is where a good change will happen? Is it at the supranational level, or is it at the within national grassroots level?
It's a great question. What I'd say is that the great thing about your generation, respective generations, is that I don't think you are making a choice for a lifetime. I think there's much more permeability among, from one level to the other and everything in between. Like, you do have the chance to migrate in your careers, and many people are doing so. That said, and I'm sure Wendy and Graham and Bill have views on this, but supranational organizations, particularly like the UN, that really are, by and large, the aggregation of the states that comprise them, are going to succeed and fail, thrive and falter on the basis of the politics, preferences, interests, and values of the powerful actors within them. And so, for example, our domestic division and the fact that our democracy, we've always had major issues, of course, through our history. And I think I have President Obama's view of exceptionalism, that the most exceptional part of our story is one of reinvention and self-criticism and, trying to get better, rather than one of, being, a glistening city on the hill without faults. We've always had faults, but certainly the division and then the attacks on democratic institutions by our current leadership, those kinds of things really impact the United States' ability to influence human rights around the world within the UN. It impacts our ability to do what Wendy and I were able to do, which is to build coalitions on behalf of, holding governments accountable for war crimes, or, creating special rapporteurs to at least document what's being done, even if the punishment doesn't happen in the here and now, to create some sanction, some form of accountability for some of the worst atrocities in the world. But it also impacts our ability to mobilize a coalition to recognize that LGBT rights are human rights, which is unfashionable, of course, and indeed downright provocative in large parts of the world. So my point is that it's fundamentally the domestic foundation that Bill mentioned, legitimacy, that gives you the legitimacy to be effective, I think, in international institutions on issues of principle. But also, and Graham has written about this, on issues of geopolitics. So put human rights to one side. The fact of the sort of standoff between the United States and Russia, and the deterioration in that relationship, it just hamstrings what the institution as a whole can do. Like the Security Council, for example, is the executive branch of the UN, and right now it's got President Xi, President Putin, and President Trump. That's not, in addition to having any one of them in charge would be very problematic in my view, but also to have the three of them with all of the sort of the collateral damage from the bilateral tensions between them really hobbles the international system as a whole at just the time, as you note, that people need to be doing more. Having said that, last point, even with the human rights recession, if you look at the key databases on democracy, we're still at or near an all-time high for democracy around the world. And there are a lot of counterexamples cropping up that aren't really denting the meme about, but whether that's Hong Kong or Turkey or Ethiopia or Egypt, even people braving, my gosh, the bravest of all perhaps in light of this, what CC is capable of. But you have these examples where I think you see the inexhaustible aspiration that people have to hold their leaders accountable and to be treated better. And I don't think the move toward demagogues and autocracy, which is spawned in large measure by a sense that governments weren't delivering, but I don't think we're entering into a phase where suddenly authoritarian and autocratic regimes become inherently better at delivering, when leaders are surrounded more by sycophants than by, truth tellers, when militaries are often, led by the most loyal rather than the most capable. I mean, there are a set of structural features of being trending in an autocratic direction that aren't actually just good usually for the practicalities of governance. But yeah, so I have a bias toward starting in the state if your goal is to see outcomes at the supranational. But I think experience in both only strengthens the other.
Great. Maybe if Wendy or Graham have anything to add, we'd welcome them. Kennedy School only let them out for about an hour, so they're going to
Yes.
have to leave.
So I'll just add one thing, and then my apologies, I do have to leave. 2 points. I think if you read Sam's book, you will see that where she began is not where she is today, except in the values and the beliefs she has and the anchor of what she learned from her family. She got a set of skills, legal skills, and journalism skills that she has used in whatever she has done. But it's the doing that mattered, and the skill set or sets became the tools to get there. So I strongly believe, and say this to everyone, where you start now is not likely to be where you end up when you are Sam's age, or even my age. And in my own case, I was very happy in Washington, D.C., living my nice life when I got a call to would I come and succeed David Gergen at the Center for Public Leadership, partly because of this guy. So nothing I ever planned on doing. But I'm here because I do think there's a deficit in public leadership around the world, and I thought maybe this was a platform where I could do something about it. But I started with a set of social work skills. As an organizer and as a clinician, as I told you before, I joke those clinical skills have helped me very much with both dictators and members of Congress, sometimes my colleagues even. And I took that from being director of child welfare when I was about 30 years old, which was absurd for me to have that job, went into politics, ran campaigns for a long time, was a partner in a Democratic media consulting firm making ads for people who were running for office, and got a call, would I come meet Warren Christopher, who was going to become Bill Clinton's Secretary of State. I had no idea why the hell he wanted to see me. So I went and saw him, and after we had a conversation and President Clinton made a decision, I got confirmed by the Senate to be the Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs, went on to be Madeleine Albright's counselor, which is not lawyer, it's consigliere, who was a good friend, then built a private sector business with her, global business, and then came back into government as Undersecretary for Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. So my great wish to everyone who is in school is I wish you an unexpected life. It's the best.
It's great.
So I can't add much to that, but I'll just make 2 quick points, and then at 1:15, I've got to go up to teach a class back at the Kennedy School. But I would say that Wendy's point underlines Samantha's. Wendy has also written a book, which I would give a shout out to her. No, that basically tells you how accidental life is and how people of talent and good values can take advantage of these accidents to make a big difference. Wendy never took a course on negotiation. Wendy never went to law school. Wendy never went to the Kennedy School. Wendy was the most successful negotiator we've had in negotiating the Iranian nuclear deal. And sitting with Zarif, the guy who's in New York today, the Iranian foreign minister, whom I've known since he was a student at Denver, where he got his PhD. So he said, wait a minute, I'm negotiating with a Jewish grandmother? He said, what are they doing? They're dissing me. I said, you better hold your wallet and hold your pants. This lady is tough. And if he asked, who does he respect as a negotiator today? He would say, give me Kerry any day. Wendy, no, she's too tough. I think to the question, basically domestic politics matter. A domestically dysfunctional U.S. is a dysfunctional system. And maybe you can find a little space to work around the edges, but I would say that's the fundamental.
I agree, totally.
Okay, thanks, Graham. So we can take a couple more questions.
Yeah, totally.
Hello, hi. Here.
Maybe stand up. Yeah,
Yeah, sure.
thanks.
Hi, I'm an LLM student here from India. I have a question to Ambassador Power. The question is I have 2 questions. One is you wear too many, not too many, wear many hats, and the theme seems to be that you seek to make change in each, while wearing each, or in each of these roles. How do you, when you're in a position which is capable of doing much more, as like, for example, as the ambassador, how do you decide to shrink change? And how much can you apply
we
this?
wanna have
How
other
can you
questions, so please get to the
How
point.
can you
Thanks.
apply this sort of logic of shrinking change when you're in wearing different hats? It's like in terms of an advice. Can you do 10 things together and at the same time shrink change to maybe one thing or one focus point is my question.
Thank you, sir.
My second question is really more abstract. Is it more important to speak truth to power or speak truth as power, pun intended?
Thank you. So I guess, I think part of your premise, if I understood it, for the first question was, when you can do so much more, why do less, right? Is that kind of what you were saying? If I could do so much more, I would have done so much more. I wasn't self-rationing in any way. You know, the way it works is, yes, I'm a member of the president's cabinet, but one of the things that you very quickly realize is that, you know, there are a lot of other individuals, this was one of Bill's points as he distilled the lessons, there are a lot of other individuals of good faith who President Obama would have chosen to be in the cabinet, who bring to bear a different perspective, maybe, you know, what will be the effect of X or Y on our economy, what is Congress's reaction to this likely to be, you know, what is the intelligence community's prognosis about how that's likely to infect our, you know, intelligence gathering relationship with a country. I mean, just which may affect our counterterrorism efforts, right? So, and part of when I mentioned preparation, which is such a boring lesson, like, did I have to, you know, live a whole life to learn that? But, you know, part of it is really anticipating what other people are bringing and what they are likely prioritizing. Because I may be meeting with the head of the Syrian White Helmets, you know, or a Kashmiri activist, and that might be the salience of the issue and the rights issues maybe looming very large. President Obama may have just come back from Walter Reed, where he's met with Americans who have been, you know, injured terribly in warfare. And so to get, you know, it's a kind of a 360 that you have to do, and also subject your own view of the overall aspiration, but also what the tool is that you're thinking about employing to its own critique, you know, and to make sure that you have people around you who are willing to tell you, like, that's you're limiting your ambition too much. Let's go bigger, or if we go there, we'll never get the Russians. And so you're just, you know, I mean, I would from a human rights perspective always be interested in pushing the envelope, but would definitely have a responsibility to be realistic about the environment in which I'm working about, but also not be so alert to constraints that I don't, you know, dream big or have, but I'll give you one example maybe to concretize it a little bit, and this gets a little bit to your truth second question, but you know, when I found myself very sort of disheartened, let's say, by the backsliding among democracies when it comes to freedom and human rights, and this was before Trump, right? This is 2015, 2016. You really started to see you couldn't kind of walk away from the statistics and the proliferation of the strongman model and the drift toward demagoguery and xenophobia and so forth in lots of places. It was kind of depressing. And believe me, it doesn't get less depressing if you're serving at the highest levels of the U.S. government. On one level, it gets more because you have Barack Obama as your president. I mean, this is the opportunity to try to fight this. But, you know, we did an awful lot to create a special rapporteur for freedom of association, because that was one of the things that governments were cutting down on, and those governments were then held accountable, and I'd be raising it in UN bodies. But I just had the feeling, like, I'm not helping anybody. I'm building the norms and challenging the drift and so forth, but not one, like I would say to my team, is one person better off because of our work? So anyway, that led us to something I describe in the book, which is part of the Shrink the Change chapter, which is we decided to just focus on 20 female political prisoners who had been jailed around the world, and not just in countries with which the United States is always complaining about human rights, like Venezuela, Syria, Iran, but also in Egypt, China, where we had big equities, or big other variables that were being pushed by our government, and where there's a lot of skepticism by our embassies that we should take up these causes. They wanted to do it, kind of maybe, but like very low key. But I hung a jumbo photo of each of these 20 women, one a day for 20 days in the glass lobby of the U.S. mission to the UN this time of year. So this was 2 years ago. Oh, no, sorry, 4 years ago now. Just 2 years before we left office. And it forced the leaders who'd locked up these women, they all drive or walk by the U.S. mission on the way into the UN General Assembly. So they kind of had to see the jumbos, or their staff had to distract them at the last minute. We ended up, again, and I don't know what role we played versus the lawyers and the family members and so forth, but 16 of the 20 women were released from jail. Now that's shrinking the change. Is it completely selling short on one level, like what America should be doing in the face of a human rights recession? Yeah, kind of, but it was also illustrative, and I think it sent a ripple effect, it's hard to measure, but to our embassies around the world to say, look, even if we can't solve the whole problem, each of these voices, fundamentally, human rights are going to be settled in these societies, not by what we do at the margins here or there using our tools. But it did, I think it had, I saw at least a subtle change in the sort of willingness of our ambassadors around the world to stick their necks out and to show up at court cases when people were being unjustly hauled into jail and so forth. And then on the truth front related, I did just try to use my voice as a tool in the toolbox. And I think it is limited, there's no question, but it also carries fewer risks than some of the other tools that the United States has employed from time to time.
So I think we have time for one last quick question, because we do want to leave opportunity to buy and sign books. So does anybody have a last quick question? Thanks.
Hi, my name is Louise, and I've got one question about your education. The title's got education in it. So really, what do you think influenced you more, educated you more? Is it individuals in your life, or is it the experiences that you've had? Thanks. Not to dodge the question, which is an interesting one, I guess I would say that it's the interplay, inevitably, because so your heart and the serendipity of your life, bring you this cast of characters, and in writing this memoir, these characters, there's me, and you're stuck with me as the narrator, but, you pick up it's just we do in our lives, we pick up all these people along the way, and it's a cast of ne'er-do-wells in some cases, and then you are living your life, and their counsel or their doubts or their own, your desire to be there for them, may divert you from what you're doing. Fundamentally, like life's tragedies also pull you in a lot of different, away from, let's say, whatever your vector, you thought your professional vector was or is. And so then you're in, like I'm in the Situation Room, so I'm having the life experience, the experience of a lifetime on one level, and I tell the story of John Prendergast, who was somebody I'd been a Darfur activist with, and basically because of my friendship with John, he's the godfather of our children, he's my best friend in the world, but he hated our policy on Darfur, understandably. I didn't like it much myself, and he started taking out ads in the newspaper, basically holding the Obama administration's feet to the fire for our sort of internal divisions on Darfur and the fact that we weren't doing anything near what we could have been doing diplomatically. And everybody started to assume I was the leaker, that I was the one telling him what was happening in the meetings because he's my best friend. Meanwhile, for the 8 years I was in government, I never talked to my best friend about policy. But instead what I did was I bitched about bureaucracy or about, or I asked him if what he thought about the editorials calling for my resignation, whether I should take them seriously or whether they were too narrow in their emphasis. And so, you can have people who are even perfectly equipped to give you substantive advice, but you sort of can't call on them. But because they are so in your corner in terms of what you're trying to achieve, they become the ideal sounding boards for the emotions of your life, and in my case, I wouldn't have had the professional life I was able to have if I wasn't able to lean on these people to take care of my kids when an emergency Security Council meeting was called. And so at a very practical level, the individuals make the work possible. And you'll see in the photos of the book, I actually have photos of John and my other really close friends with my children. And people are like, wait, you really want to waste, can't we get more of you in your baseball uniform when you came to America as a child? I'm like, no, people have to see that, it takes a bloody village, you can't, there's no, when I'm off, suddenly Syria stages a gas attack, or Putin goes into Ukraine, to Crimea, and I'm, with no planning, have no childcare and no nothing, and my husband is teaching at Harvard Law School, and I'm living in New York with the kids, these people that, I want to show people what those friendships and those individuals mean. Because, and the same is true for our nanny, who I wrote about at great length. Often those people they're not characters in the larger story, and yet there's no way I would have achieved it. Shrink the change, no change. There'd be no change, because I wouldn't have. I was trying to do both at the same time, and it's really hard to do both at the same time without support.
So thank you. Let's all join in.
Thank you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you.